You're watching The Front Row. Thank you for staying with us. We're talking about the Kenya Tanzania relations. So we've just had a conversation with Kwame Owino on the trade ties, some of the implications of the agreements that have been made today. I want us now to go a bit diplomatic, take a look at the relationship that these two countries have had. But before that, let's take a look at what happened earlier. Tanzanian President Samia Suluhu Hassan began her two-day state visit to Kenya today that saw her agree with her host, President Uhuru Kenyatta, to strengthen ties between the two neighbors. The two leaders vowed to improve ties in trade, infrastructure, transport, tourism, culture, and security. Speaking at State House, Nairobi, after talks, the two presidents announced they will cooperate in the fight against COVID-19, which has slowed down business between the two countries. Chris Thairo starts us off at this hour with that report.
The plane carrying Tanzanian President Samia Suluhu Hassan and her entourage touched down at the Jomo Kenyatta International Airport at 10:30 a.m. Tuesday. At hand to receive her were Cabinet Secretaries Rachel Omamo and Ambassador Amina Mohamed. And at State House, Nairobi, her host, President Uhuru Kenyatta, was ready to receive the first woman president in the East African region. Upon her arrival at State House, she inspected a guard of honor mounted by the Kenya Army 9th Battalion from Eldoret. This was followed by a 21-gun salute. And after a 2-hour closed-door meeting, the leaders emerged with key agreements.
Na mawaziri wetu wameambiwa wahakikishe ya kwamba wanakutana mara kwa mara, kuhakikisha ya kwamba wanaendelea kuzingatia uhusiano wetu na kuweza kutatua shida ndogo ndogo ambazo zinasumbua wananchi wetu wakati wanafanya biashara kati yao, wakati wanatembeleana kati yao.
Kama mnavyofahamu, nchi zetu mbili sio tu majirani, kama nilivyosema, ni marafiki na ndugu, na kutokana na urafiki tulionao tumewezesha kukuza ushirikiano wa kiuchumi. Kwa mfano, wakati wa mazungumzo yetu nimemwarifu kaka yangu Rais Kenyatta kuwa Kenya inashika nafasi ya 5 kwa uwekezaji ndani ya nchi ya Tanzania, ikitanguliwa na mataifa mengi kutoka nje, lakini ndani ya Jumuiya ya Afrika Mashariki Kenya ni ya kwanza na kiulimwengu inashika nafasi ya 5.
Top on the talks was easing restrictions and tariffs at the border points.
Tumekubaliana pia ya kwamba mambo ya mawasiliano tutaendelea kuona vile tutayaimarisha, kutoka safari za ndege, safari za reli, safari za kupitia baharini na kule upande ya kanda ya ziwa, safari za barabara.
Tumekubaliana kuendelea kushughulikia baadhi ya changamoto, hususan vikwazo visivyo vya kodi ambavyo vinatokea katika mipaka yetu. Tumekubaliana kwamba hivyo sasa vikaondoke, na kwa pamoja tumeitaka tume yetu ya ushirikiano baina ya Kenya na Tanzania iwe inakaa na kutoa suluhu ya vikwazo vinavyojitokeza sasa hivi na halafu, ili vikwazo hivi visiwepo.
Another agreement was on how to tackle COVID-19.
Ni kwa mawaziri wetu wa afya kukaa na kurahisisha mfumo wa kuingia na kuchekiwa kwenye mambo haya yaliyoingia ya COVID au corona. Watu wetu wapate huduma za haraka, kupima, kuchekiwa ili waweze kupita na biashara ziendelee.
Wewe tunakuona kama dada yetu. Wewe tunakuona kama ndugu yetu. Na nchi ya Tanzania na nchi ya Kenya ni kitu kimoja, na safari hii itaenda mbali sana kuhakikisha ya kwamba uhusiano wa nchi zetu mbili utaendelea kuimarika.
Both heads of state signed an MOU on cooperation in natural gas transportation by constructing a pipeline from Tanzania to Kenya.
Tumekubaliana pia ya kwamba na tumeweka mikataba haswa ya mambo kuhusu kujenga pipeline ya gas kutoka Dar es Salaam mpaka Mombasa, na hiyo itarahisisha bei ya stima katika nchi yetu.
Jinsi ya kupata nishati, umeme au gesi kutoka upande mmoja kwenda upande mwingine. Tuna hiyo miradi mmoja tulishasaini mkataba leo. Tunachokwenda kufanya ni kusimamia utekelezaji.
After the talks at State House Nairobi, President Suluhu headed to the mausoleum of Kenya's founding father Mzee Jomo Kenyatta at Parliament Buildings in Nairobi, where she laid a wreath. Her two-day state visit in the country will culminate with an address in the bicameral parliament. Already speakers of both houses have gazetted Wednesday afternoon for that business. Chris Dairo, KTN News, State House, Nairobi.
Right, the day that was, tomorrow is day 2 of that state visit. Let's speak to Dr. Kigen Murumbasi, who's the chairperson of the International Relations Society of Kenya, as well as Nicodemus Minde, foreign policy expert. Let's just take a start by what we've seen today, the talks, the conversations the two have had. But just this visit in itself and how warm these two presidents seemingly are towards each other, is it a new dawn for the relationship between these two countries? I'll start with you, Dr. Keegan.
I think when we look at this visit by Samia Suluhu, one of the things that comes to mind is that in terms of the regional diplomacy or international diplomacy, she's not a new member on the board. She's been there. She has been a key player in the former President Magufuli's international engagement. She's been really proactive at the international level. Now, looking at the relations between Kenya and Tanzania previously, from a diplomatic point of view, you can see that there was a bit of misunderstandings, probably due to concerns of dominance. So we could see the dominance principle maybe coming to the forefront, where the countries are seeing each other probably as competitors. But this visit brings in other dimensions, as you see, the talks about cooperation in terms of economics. We can see now there's more of reciprocity. So we probably will see a lot of the reciprocity principle being applied, where the countries will come up with agreements that will bring about mutual cooperation, as well as the identity principle. We know that Tanzania and Kenya share quite a long history together. All the way from the Joint Commission on Cooperation was put forward in 1988, which didn't really take off. But we can see now there might be a rebirth of this, and probably we'll see less of the dominance principle playing out. We might see more of reciprocity and, of course, identity coming in, which is a big asset to the East Africa community as a region as a whole.
And I like that you mentioned the Joint Commission of Cooperation, because they have said, the two presidents have said that they will now ensure that there are more regular meetings to just ensure that they sort out some of these quick issues as they go. Just by the fact that they have set it up again and they said that it will be up and running, what does it say? What are we likely to see?
Yeah, I think in diplomacy, one of the key enablers of diplomacy is communication, free flow of communication. And as we see now with this commission, and of course there was mention on issues dealing with global health, the COVID-19 pandemic we're facing. So I think we're going to see an expansion of the diplomatic engagement between these two countries in 6 predominant realms. One is, of course, the global health diplomacy. We're facing the COVID-19 pandemic. And however, even during the pandemic, I think trade between these two countries has been quite positive, especially on tourism. So we're also probably going to see a lot of cultural diplomacy between these two. Of course, border community diplomacy, which has been a big issue in the recent past, will be resolved through this opening up of communication channels, economic diplomacy, through the agreements we're seeing being made. Of course, this will add into the East Africa Protocol on the common market. Regional diplomacy as a whole will also benefit from this. And of course, we're going to see a lot of people-to-people diplomacy between these two. Once we start seeing the free movement of persons, etc. So on a whole, once we open up this communication between the two countries, then there's a lot of optimism on the kind of diplomacy multifaceted, multi-frontier diplomacy that will happen between Kenya and Tanzania, which is good for the East Africa community as a whole.
Let's bring in Nicodemus at this point. President Suluhu Hassan is seen to slowly be undoing what her predecessor had been doing, the hard stance, the iron fist that he seemingly ruled with. And I put that in quote unquote because some would disagree to that. But looking at how Magufuli went about relations with Tanzania's neighbors and especially Kenya, Suluhu is seen to be slowly trying to undo that. What does that speak to?
Thank you, Akisa, for having me and inviting me to the show. Regarding this shift in President Suluhu's foreign policy approach, you can see there's a discernible shift from the time she just began. She took office after the death of the late president. This shift has been influenced by a number of issues. Of course, you have rightly mentioned that previously Tanzania, of course, under President Magufuli, presided over a very isolationist approach of foreign policy. And I think after the presidential address at the parliament in Dodoma 2 weeks ago, President Samia Suluhu Hassan made clear intentions of renewing Tanzania's position in the diplomatic world and international sphere, and which is a very positive thing. And we saw this with, first of all, her visit to Uganda to sign off the EACOP deal, and of course now this visit to Kenya. But of course, she has also met with the IMF director through a telephone conversation. And this just shows you how much there is some sort of a shift in our foreign policy approach, which for the past 6 years was very much isolationist in its approach.
These new deals that have been signed, and I'd like to put this out to you as well, like the gas pipeline one, Kenya seemed to be quite disappointed that Tanzania faced Uganda on this. Our economist there has said that no loss really, it would not make any economic sense. But are they to wipe the tears and to just try and tell Kenya that perhaps we are still together? How are you looking at it?
Well, the pipeline deal that Kenya missed, in quotes, was largely, as your first guest mentioned, was it was made out of business reasons, and it didn't make enough business reasons for the pipeline to pass through Kenya. And of course, something that maybe we should also point out is the growing strategic interest of Tanzania in the region, which attracts investments and so on and so forth. So it was appealing even for Uganda to actually sign off the deal with Tanzania as opposed to Kenya. But again, coming to your question about this, the gas pipeline deal that has been signed today, it just shows you that these two countries really understand the importance of bilateral trade, bilateral engagements in matters of big infrastructural projects. Especially, this comes at a time when Tanzania was highly seclusionist in terms of its approach. You know that there was a period around 2013 where these other East African countries decided to go by themselves, and Tanzania and Burundi actually, didn't want to join these other 3 East African countries. So this is quite a big move for Tanzania and Kenya in terms of enhancing these bilateral deals and bilateral trade.
Right, I want us to quickly take a look at the history between these two countries. Before we quite understand where we're going, it would be prudent for us to take a look at where have we come from, Kenya and Tanzania. Let's quickly take a look at those graphics. Before then, we try and dissect the future of relationships. Taking us back to 1967, in the Arusha Declaration, where Tanzania adopted socialism, creating points of conflict with Kenya's capitalist ideas. Disagreements on ideology started back in 1967. 10 years later, Tanzania's president then, Julius Nyerere, closed the Kenya-Tanzania border, leading to the collapse of the East African community. And then we would later see in 2010 local authorities in Karatu district, about 200 kilometers outside Arusha, ban Kenyan middlemen from negotiating onion prices with farmers. So then taking us back 6 years later, in 2016, President John Pombe Magufuli said Tanzania will not be part of Kenya's 380 billion shilling diesel-powered standard gauge railway. And remember, that was the cost then. The project, and later unveiled plans to build Tanzania an electric-powered train. Yet another disagreement between the two countries. Still in 2016, Tanzania declined to invest in the regional Kenya-driven LAPSSET project. And of course, it's an ongoing project. A year later, a Tanzanian court ordered the auction of at least 1,300 cows belonging to Kenyan herders after they failed to pay a fine of 23 million Kenya shillings. A year later, in 2018, Tanzania banned 5,000 chicks imported from Kenya by local businessmen, and a few months later banned another 6,400 birds over avian flu fears. The Tanzanian government banned the importation of chicks in 2007. Still in 2018, Kenya imposed new tariffs on Tanzanian products after the country ignored a deal that granted Kenyan-made chocolate, ice cream and biscuits and restricted entry into Tanzania. And then in 2018 still, President Uhuru Kenyatta and President John Pombe Magufuli commissioned the Namanga one-stop border post to ease trade. And it is at this point that there were hopes that perhaps this was a new dawn into easing relations between these two countries. But then that was not the case. In 2019, Tanzania and Kenya got into a trade war over the testing of goods across the borders, and Kenya filed a complaint with the EAC Secretariat after Tanzania held Kenyan goods for more than 7 days to collect samples for testing. Another war that broke out there. And in 2020, Kenya closed its border with Tanzania in May over COVID-19 infection fears, but exempted cargo trucks. However, drivers would had to be tested before gaining access to the country. Just the history of the tough love that has been between these two countries. And getting back to our guest, Dr. Kigen, looking at the frosty relations that have been there between these two countries, dating back to 1967, looking at where we are now and Suluhu seemingly trying to right these wrongs, how soon would we expect things to get back to normal?
Indeed, when we look at the history of it, there has been a little bit of the frosty relations, trying to see how, cooperation, competition between the two. Now, looking at your question, how soon would we probably see benefits of this? I think it's quite clear that Suluhu is coming up with solutions to these broken relations between these two countries. And once you have that opening of the diplomatic communication between the two, and you have significant agreements coming in. And if you look at the EAC as a whole, we are seeing that one of the key problems has been the infrastructure and intra-African trade between the countries. So I think the visit today, as we have seen, and some of the talks, some of the agreements they have come up with, brings quite a lot of optimism on immediate results of that. Of course, it wouldn't really take 2 days to roll back all the differences that have accumulated over the years. However, we're seeing that there will be a positive movement towards reciprocity, especially once you see the use, for example, of the transport route in Lake Victoria, where we're seeing the community getting involved. And you've really mentioned, in 2016, where we had the community issues, and now we're seeing a lot of community diplomacy coming in. So I would really be optimistic to try and expect that the relations between the two countries will actually warm up in the near future. However, this is a work that has just begun. And as it continues, as the diplomatic engagement unfolds, then we're going to see more and more areas of cooperation between the two. So I think at the short term, we're going to start seeing some positive ripple effects of the agreements that have been signed today between the two heads of state.
The mistrust that has been there between the two countries, Nicodemus, and as we have seen, dates back to 1967, a very long time ago, and the mistrust keeps rearing its head now and then. What would it take for these countries to undo that?
Well, you're right. There's been mistrust and the right terminologies, intransigency between the two countries over the years. You can recall, in fact, if you want to put a historical context, the first leader, Jomo Kenyatta, had also frosty relations with Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, and this carried on until the first, the first East African community collapsed in 1977, and so on and so forth. So, going to your question on what should be done or what can be done to actually, thaw these relations and also maybe improve and enhance these bilateral relations, which I think are largely historical and embedded in brotherliness and neighborliness and so on and so forth. The right way is through public diplomacy, people-to-people diplomacy, and enhancing cultural ties that bind these two countries on issues such as art, music, film, and so on and so forth. And this is the work that can be done through embassies and so on and so forth, so that they can be able to enhance intercultural, connections and cooperation, which is mostly needed. Of course, when you talk about high politics or high economics, there's the issues of, talking about regional integration. But the number one thing that actually binds these two countries is the people. And once you get it right through people-to-people cooperation, minimizing the mistrust. And of course, there's another very important thing: miscommunication, misinformation, stereotypes, and so on and so forth, which for me as a Tanzanian national I've seen and bore the brunt of this negative stereotyping, which of course you can't do away with it with them for entirely, but there is an important lesson that we need to draw, that is, how do we enhance people-to-people diplomacy through cultural engagements, through music, through film, through art, and so on and so forth. And this can be done through embassies and the ministries involved.
And at that very point, let's bring in the kind of leadership style that President Suluhu has adopted since she came into power, clearly moving away from the shadow of her predecessor. We are seeing a very stark difference between these two presidents. Being a Tanzanian, how is this being received by the public there?
Well, there is a lot of warmth, especially coming from the fact that not only we have a new president, but of course this is a female president who is very motherly, who is very warm, who is very engaging, and even in her approach to issues, she is very calm, she listens, and her approach to to solving these issues are largely based on listening and engaging with the general populations. And I think this has really endeared her to the people. This is not to mean that the previous president had any bad issues, but there is a stark difference in terms of approach. And this is actually, being seen through her engagements now diplomatically and regionally and internationally. And you saw in her policies that she outlined during her speech in Parliament, foreign policy was one of the key issues that she outlined.
Right, we'll get back to that. And I'm speaking to Dr. Kigen Murumbasi, who's the chairperson of the International Relations Society of Kenya, as well as Nicodemus joining us from our City Center studios. Nicodemus Minde is a foreign policy expert. I'd like us to take a short break. We're still having a lot of comments coming in, so when we get back, we'll be taking a look at what you're saying just before we wrap up the program. You're watching The Front Row. Thank you for staying with us.